Puerto Rico can't catch a break. As if the savage economic crisis that has been suffering for more than a decade, its declaration of bankruptcy, and the devastation wrought by hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017 weren't enough, well, now they have constant earthquakes to contend with. So far, there have been more than 2,000 recorded seismic movements since 2019, and they've continued into 2020. I don't know what else could possibly happen next on this island. Some good luck, perhaps, because that seems like the only thing they haven't been hit with. However, what stands out most is that sometimes this place seems more like a territory in sub-Saharan Africa than an incorporated territory of the United States itself. So, what makes me say that, you ask? As you know, Hurricane Maria caused enormous chaos from which the island, more than 2 years later, has still not fully recovered. And we're not just talking about the more than 3,000 lives that were lost. The hurricane left the island without electricity for weeks. In some areas, electricity was not restored until 11 months later. In addition, more than 90,000 houses were destroyed, and damage to all kinds of infrastructure was enormous. Look, let's be honest. For a hurricane to cause damage is something that we can predict. For the aftermath to take years and years to be fixed, and for the chaos still to be widespread, that's not so predictable. Or at least, you wouldn't expect that to be the case in a territory that belongs to the United States, would you? And let me highlight this here. We are talking, in some cases, of almost 1 year without electricity. Sure, these things may happen in the developing world, and that's to be expected, but in the United States, really? The fact is that all these natural disasters came at a particularly difficult time for Puerto Rico. As we told you in a previous video that I'll link to in the description, in 2015, the island's government had declared bankruptcy and the economic situation was bleak, really bleak. And right then, to make matters worse, the island was hit with not one, but 2 hurricanes. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. What the post-Maria Puerto Rico looks like, how the situation was dealt with, and what future we can expect for an island that is going through what is perhaps the worst period in its recent history.
The aftermath of Maria, beyond the figures.
2 devastating hurricanes in less than 1 month. First, Hurricane Irma that hit the island in the north, and later Hurricane Maria that hit it with tremendous force. Something like the final hook of a boxer who's about to be KO'd. Now, as a Caribbean island, Puerto Rico is very exposed to this type of phenomenon, and it's natural for hurricanes to cause damage. That's perfectly clear. The point is that given its per capita income and level of development, the island suffered far greater consequences than it theoretically should have. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, why did these hurricanes cause so much damage? Wasn't Puerto Rico prepared to deal with such emergencies? And why did it take so long to rebuild? And then, when the rebuilding was done, the problem still continued. In short, what exactly happened with Puerto Rico? That's the question that we want to answer. Well, to better understand what occurred on this island, we can take a look at what happened to the electrical system in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. For a particular area of a territory to be without electricity after a hurricane is understandable, and to some extent it's normal. However, for a whole island the size of Puerto Rico, with more than 3 million inhabitants, to be out of electricity, that's a different story. It's a clue that things weren't exactly going well before the arrival of the hurricane. And the truth is, that's exactly what we need to look at. Puerto Rico's electrical infrastructure was in a precarious state. It was something you'd expect in a developing country, but not what you'd expect in a free incorporated territory of the US. Thus, due to poor planning and especially poor maintenance, the storm took out at least a quarter of the electricity transmission towers and disabled 40% of the substations. The result was a complete blackout. To make matters worse, the power production systems are on the opposite side of the island to the major consumption centers. Let me explain that. While 70% of the fossil fuel plants are in the south, 70% of the demand is concentrated in the north, which is where San Juan, the capital, and some other heavily populated towns are located. This distribution requires that the connections are well protected, something that, as you can see, was not the case on the island. In fact, the high-voltage line connecting the production centers to the consumption centers was shattered when the hurricane passed. In short, the damage was enormous, and it meant repairs took a long time. Now, at this point, many of you are probably thinking, well, hold on, Simon, why so much insistence on Puerto Rico's electrical system? Well, that's because it serves as something like a stress test, a case study that illustrates the pathology that really hides at the core of the problems that this place experiences. And look, I'm talking about problems that we can find not only in Puerto Rico, but also in many other places in Latin America.
Predictable collapse.
The Puerto Rican electrical system has essentially been a publicly owned company since the 1940s. In fact, a government company, the Electric Power Authority, had a monopoly on distribution and electricity production until 2010. And today, it continues to be the most important player on the island. And you know what? This situation mirrors almost everything that happens in this place. Unfortunately, in 2017, this monopolistic public company went bankrupt. And it's pretty difficult for a company that has a monopoly on a basic service to become bankrupt. But well, that's exactly what happened. The fact is that it did so just a few months after the Puerto Rican government's own declaration of bankruptcy, which was the largest government bankruptcy in the history of the United States. And the reasons for both bankruptcy filings were pretty much the same. On the one hand, the extravagance, lack of accountability, and incompetence of local politicians played an essential role. Let's not kid ourselves here. In the end, the blame usually lies closest to home. But in this case, they weren't the only ones at fault. In a way, it's a story we've told you before on VisualPolitik. The United States also played a key role in both bankruptcies.
Puerto Rico. We love Puerto Rico.
It's something we've already talked about. The enormously precarious situation in which Puerto Rico currently finds itself is due, in addition to the island's incompetent government and rampant corruption, to the abusive and crippling laws which this semi-colonial territory is submitted to by the United States. Take, for example, the case of PREPA, the Electrical Power Authority. The 2017 bankruptcy, which was filed just a few months before Irma and Maria descended onto the island, was primarily due to the 1996 deletion of Section 936 of the U.S. Federal Government's Internal Revenue Code. What did this section say? Well, it basically granted exemptions in federal taxes for companies located in US-controlled territories such as Puerto Rico. In the case of this Caribbean island, a period of 10 years grace was established as a transition phase until the total elimination of these tax incentives could be established. This was a process that was completed in 2005. So what do you think happened next? Exactly. Just a few months later, a huge crisis ensued. Puerto Rico lost all kinds of investments, particularly industrial investments. It was truly massive. To give you an idea, a whopping 60% of the electricity company's industrial customers just left the island. Of course, this quickly led to an increase in unemployment, poverty, and the informal economy. And this sequence of events meant electricity consumption plummeted, something that in turn caused a sharp decline in the accounts of the public electricity company. And if their management already left a lot to be desired, now they had to deal with a huge drop in revenue, a black hole of truly epic proportions. In this way, not only did the Electric Power Authority begin to accumulate huge amounts of debt, but any modernization, transformation, and even non-urgent maintenance plans were put on hold. In fact, the company even cut costs in ordinary maintenance tasks, and still nothing was enough to prevent the power company from going bankrupt 10 years later. In other words, we're talking about a company that was sunk by the mismanagement of Puerto Rican politicians and by the decisions of those in Washington, a very toxic mix. And it was a mix that eventually blanketed the whole island. Maybe Puerto Ricans not having a voice or the right to vote in the US elections is a contributing factor. And don't tell me the old story that they elected a kind of spokesperson to represent them in Congress. Do not be fooled. If you don't have a vote, it doesn't count. So Puerto Rico is a territory completely overlooked by the United States. Although they are officially a part of the United States, it is more fair to say that they are under the rule of the American superpower. In any case, what does seem clear is that Washington politicians don't trust each other at all, and they trust Puerto Rican politicians even less. And on it goes. Given the history of corruption, the misuse of public funds, and its poor internal management, it's hardly surprising. But Puerto Ricans don't do much either. They prefer to say nothing rather than change the situation. Proof of the extent of this mistrust could be seen after the impact of Hurricane Maria. At the time, the then Republican majority United States Congress, in accordance with the Trump administration, forced Puerto Rico to create a reconstruction plan that would be tightly audited by the Puerto Rico Oversight Board, a federal agency set up to monitor government accounts after the island declared bankruptcy. But not content with that, the US authorities also imposed a series of very demanding and almost unprecedented standards. For example, any contract in excess of $10 million for reconstruction had to be closely monitored by the board. Something that may sound like a good idea, but which in practice caused a huge problem. The board is not exactly winning any races in task completion. In effect, what Congress did was to bureaucratize all reconstruction tasks to truly crippling levels. Or you could say, what seems like a good idea turned into a bureaucratic nightmare.
Puerto Rico was rocked by Hurricane Maria, ruined by FEMA's negligence, reviled by Trump. USA Today.
And it doesn't end there. Another example of this mistrust is the extraordinary and unprecedented requirements imposed on the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, i.e. the two federal agencies responsible for distributing and managing disaster recovery funds. Among other things, in April 2018, the federal government imposed a spending limit on these agencies that could not be higher in any case than the estimate of costs made by the government of Puerto Rico for reconstruction. In other words, they wanted to avoid overspending at all costs. Thus, if unforeseen events or unexpected situations appeared during the process, Puerto Rico would just have to wait. And I'm sure this may also seem like a reasonable move, right? At least until you realize that it's basically an invitation to overestimate the damage and inflate reconstruction budgets, which is exactly what the government of Puerto Rico did. But that leads us to a debate that would need several videos to untangle. The point is that, as you can see, throughout the entire process, these measures gave the impression that the federal government was much more concerned with controlling Puerto Rican politicians than with the timely restoration of the island and essential public services. So, can the US be blamed for this, and why does it all seem so dodgy? Well, let's take a look.
Puerto Rico, from bad to worse.
Of course, Puerto Rico's problems don't all stem from federal laws that are totally out of touch with Puerto Rican reality. However, to make such a statement is really only just skimming the truth. The truth is that for many years, the various governments on the island have completely neglected spending on the very serious financial problems that the island had and have devoted themselves instead to basically asking for more and more money from the United States Congress. The aftermath of the hurricanes gave us some indication of the extent of their incapacity. Just take a look at what happens in the weeks following the catastrophe.
In Puerto Rico, containers full of goods sit undistributed at ports. National Public Radio.
And friends, don't think for a moment that we're talking about isolated cases. Not at all. In fact, in early 2020, numerous pallets of humanitarian aid given after Hurricane Maria that had not been distributed were discovered at a warehouse. Of course, by then, many of the products were out of date.
Puerto Rico emergency director fired after residents discover warehouse full of Hurricane Maria supplies. CNN.
And sadly, that's not the first time. In fact, this inability to deal with problems and constant suspicions of corruption have been, and still are, a vicious cycle. The result is that even today, in one forgotten corner of the United States, many homes are still damaged and many roofs are still covered with blue tarpaulins. So, given such a backdrop, you won't be surprised to know that the harsh crisis that began in 2006 continues today. The government public accounts remain in almost as bad a state as when the country declared itself bankrupt. In fact, you could say that Puerto Rico is beyond needing an auditor or an accountant. They could just skip straight to a taxidermist. Further, the mass exodus of Puerto Ricans to the United States has reduced the population by more than 600,000 people since 2004. Anyway, as you can see, between one thing and another, the island is falling apart. What happened to the Electric Power Authority is a good reflection of what happened to this territory as a whole. So at this point, the burning question is, how can Puerto Rico get out of this? Well, perhaps the United States would have to put aside its paternalism and allow this territory to be managed with full autonomy, for better or for worse. At least that way, local politicians will have no excuses. In the meantime, any adjustment plan won't make much difference either. If the model is not changed on a fundamental level, you can't expect results to change either. But what do you think? How do you think Puerto Rico can escape this crisis? If you'd like to leave your opinion in the comments section below, please do so. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.